Good afternoon. Lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you for those of you who actually offer to give talks as well. They will be very short because there's so many of us. The first person to talk to you is Jeffrey Ziman, who's John's younger brother. And there's another brother, who is even younger. So, Jeff, would you like to come over here and start with us?
From here or from that one? Right, talk from the podium?
Yeah.
Gives me a bit of protection. If you cannot hear at the back, please raise your hand. My older brother John delighted in using terms like Duggan's turn to graphically describe the process of gaining promotion through seniority rather than through merit. Accordingly, I have to start my remarks today by confessing that I find, with John's passing, that I have now inherited the position of patriarch of the Ziman family in this way. Let me welcome you all here. We're all here to honour and celebrate the memory of my brother John. If he was with us, I can imagine John saying something like, yes, 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 all very appropriate, the formalities have to be observed, you know. And after all, this is the best club in town. He might also have alluded slyly to the unofficial family motto of Claymore Omnia Vincit, loosely translated as noise conquers all. I would like to talk about John mainly from the family perspective. Others here, I'm sure, will be doing justice to John's intellectual, academic and professional accomplishments. I must tell you, though, that I did have some direct experience of some of his skills in that regard. It happened that I was a student at the University of Oxford, and my brother was a lecturer in mathematics there. While I did not have any reservations about cutting the lectures of the renowned Professor Lindemann, I did feel a certain obligation to attend those of my brother. That was just as well, because as many of you know, John's lectures were always carefully thought out, logically organised, and clearly presented. The fact that I eventually graduated with a respectable, honors degree, I think can reasonably be attributed to this family connection. John was 8 years older than I am, so I can't recall much about his formative years growing up in New Zealand. I do remember being very impressed by his attaining the rank of King Scout and leading his Boy Scout patrol on bicycle camping trips. I don't consider myself and John to have been particularly alike, although we probably were. I remember once about 30 years ago when John was visiting me in San Francisco, he arrived from England wearing a crumpled sports jacket that turned out to be exactly identical in style and material to one I happened to own. To me, John always seemed to be a mixture of the complex and the simple. In some respects, he was a dreamer, but in other ways, eminently down-to-earth and practical. I know that he, like me, could never escape the extraordinary high standards that our parents set for us, particularly with regard to love of learning, integrity, and striving for excellence in whatever we undertook. Interestingly, in a biographical note that I came across recently, John himself described his feelings, that he described himself as being the absolutely devoted son of a father whose goodness and grace filled my own spirit from infancy. As many of you know, John much preferred to express himself in the written rather than the spoken word. In spite of his academic standing, he could sometimes be shy and awkward in social situations. And I'm sure that he would be the first to admit that small talk was not his strong suit, but he greatly enjoyed and relished lively intellectual discussion. When someone passes away, there are many dimensions to the loss. For me, my brother Robert, who's here, and my brother-in-law Hugh, there will be one very significant deprivation. 35 years ago, after the death of our mother, John instigated the practice of having a continuously circulating family round-robin letter. As the missive came round, each of us would remove the oldest segment and add a new section and pass it on. The package would typically come round every 6 or 10 weeks. John's contribution would always make interesting reading, whether it was a lively description of his many travels, or his battles with bureaucracy, or the mysteries of computers, or of his annoyance at incompetence and injustice. Some special memories remain. While my wife Anne and I were visiting England in April 2003, John and Joan arranged and warmly hosted a very successful Ziman family party at their place in Oakley. More recently, my oldest son and his family were visiting from California. John and Joan gave them hospitality and a conducted tour of Oxford, which they felt was the highlight of their trip. Sometimes, in retrospect, we find our good deeds that were unknown. My brother-in-law, Hugh Myers, recently told me of the special attention that John paid to him with regard to the passing of my beloved sister Barbara several years ago. So friends, where do we stand today? Well, without John around, the pompous, the incompetent and the corrupt can rest a little easier, knowing that they'll be spared being skewered by John's pen, or perhaps more accurately, wounded by the power of his word processor. The family, we will all miss someone who, even though he often had difficulty in expressing it, without any doubt, cared about everyone and loved every one of us very much. I'd like to say to Joan, to Claire, Greg, who's unfortunately not here, Greg's John's son in Australia, and Kate and their families particularly, I extend my heartfelt sympathies. I hope that in the last few months I've been able, even at a distance, to indicate my concern for them and readiness to help them adjust to the gap left in their lives. I also want to echo John's thought and thank every one of you for coming today, as well as the many others who could not come, who communicated to us so many kind words of your respect, love and devotion to my distinguished brother. In conclusion, I truly believe that despite some frustrations, John tried his best to live up to the finest Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, that is, attempting to repair the world. I thank you all very much.
Okay, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Harry Ziman. I'm John's nephew. I'm the son of John's youngest brother, Robert. At the outset, I'd just like to say it's fantastic to see so many people joining us at today's celebration. It's a great opportunity to give thanks for a life full of achievement and also to reminisce together. Today is about saving John's professional accomplishments. So how can I, as a family member, add to the occasion? Well, maybe I can provide you with a context that will enrich your understanding of a man who is both complex but also straightforward. Our family has always been spread all over the world, and even today we don't get together often. Email makes it easy to keep in contact, but that's not always been the case, and this causes me to think about the past. John's childhood was in New Zealand, a very long way from here, a distance that he and his ancestors must have been all too aware of. His grandfather was a refugee, smuggled out of Eastern Europe, and ending up in England, alone, not speaking the language, aged 14. Many adventures later, he settled in New Zealand, where a variety of ambitious business ventures succeeded and failed. Perhaps this was an early sign of academic ability in the genes, but there is no mistaking them in the next generation. John's father was New Zealand's 5th Rhodes Scholar, the first from Auckland. And John's mother is of no less interesting or accomplished stock. The Gasters were expelled from Romania for political agitation and were rapidly welcomed to England's Jewish community, where they gained great influence and a reputation for scholarship. I wonder how much John was aware of his family history. Could this, either consciously or unconsciously, have contributed to his sense of social justice? I don't know the answer to this question, but what I do know is his ancestors would have been proud of him. They would have been proud of the stand he took, the value he espoused, and his independence of mind. And they would have admired his application of a compassionate rapier to facile argument. Speaking of influences, let me say a little more about John's impact on me. As a child, it was impossible not to be aware that my professorial uncle was a most distinguished scientist, but he's always willing to give a little boy some of his precious time. Whether he caused me to read physics, I don't know. But it's probably fair to say he did influence my choice of King's Cambridge. And the law of unintended consequences applied, of course, from my wife at King's. So I suppose John is responsible for my son, who I think is probably the youngest person in the building today. My academic studies were initially in theoretical physics, and then I switched to mechanical engineering. But John would have enjoyed and appreciated the fact that the only fellowship I sought and obtained was to the Royal Society of Chemistry. But alas, it came just too late. The influence on me is nothing compared to that he had on his immediate family. John's son Gregory, who can't be here today, asked me to share a few words with you. Gregory says, "My father was a very loving man, thoughtful, kind, and supportive of our childhood adventures. He started the travel bug in me when he took me to Manchester on the train, correctly reasoning that I would learn more from the experience than from another day in school. Leaving home at 19 to travel to Australia and New Zealand on my own, his words of encouragement and pride meant much to me. I was so grateful Dad and Joan were able to come to Australia and see our daughter Abby. Sadly, he didn't manage to see our newborn son Ryan, but he did have a hand in picking his name." Anyway, I think it's a good point to finish and to hand over to John's daughter Kate.
Thank you.
I'm afraid to me again. I'm not Kate. You probably noticed. This is Kate here, but sadly Kate's had a car accident on the way up to the event today, so I think you'd like me to read it?
Please, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, so you need to imagine this is Kate speaking. This is a piece that she just called Dad. Okay. This is one of the hardest but easiest things I've ever had to write. So I'd just like to tell you about my dad, John Ziman. Dad was a kind and gentle man who knew how to listen and to talk to the youngest and oldest of people he met. He never judged people and always had a kind word to say about everyone. Dad loved to walk, and often when we were young, would take us on adventures to places we'd never been before, and somehow would manage to get us lost. Perhaps this was part of the adventure. Often when we were young, Dad would read books to us at bedtime. He would so capture your imagination with his power of reading that you have felt that you're a character in the book and not wanting to ever stop reading, especially when it's Dr. Dolittle or even Sherlock Holmes. Dad loved to sit and relax in his garden and admire all the hard work that he put in. Even when at times the deer would wander into the vegetable patch and sneak off with his prized vegetables. Dad had an ability to make you always feel special. Even when you had thought he was not listening, he would just be quiet, take a mental note, digest, and at some point reply, although not always spontaneously. But he was always there for you. So there is one thing I would like to say. Thank you, Dad, for being there for me and my family. Your proud daughter, Kate.
Now, there's anybody here who can admit to being under 10 years old may now go with Bess. Bess, would you like to stand? Does everyone know? Right. We should have 2 girls and a boy. Is that right? Hi, Janet. And they're going to go on a special tour. Well, that was just lovely, and now we'll see whether the Bristol Physics Department can do equally well. Michael, would you like to come up here and talk? Head of the table.
You didn't tell me, Joe, that it's a competition.
Well, you don't have to worry, it's not a beauty competition.
Volker Heine, who was a colleague of John a very long time ago, has written something which he's asked me to read. So first of all, it's his contribution. When Neville Mott came to Cambridge in 1954 as Cavendish professor, he brought in John Ziman from Oxford to start a group in solid-state theory. Of course, the Cavendish laboratory had been traditionally the department of experimental physics, with just 1 or 2 theoreticians in the experimental groups. The main effort in theoretical physics was centred on what is now the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics, but no one there had any interest in solid-state physics. However, experience during World War II and developments in the USA had shown Mott, who was a professor there, the importance of strong theory groups allied to the experimental effort. And moreover, solid-state physics was becoming a leading area of research in the Cavendish laboratory, with the work of Schoenberg and Pippard mapping out Fermi surfaces of metals for the first time. Tabor's work on solid-state physics, crystallography, including recent work from Peter Hirsch, and of course the recent very important work of Crick and Watson on DNA, and more. So it made sense to start a group on solid-state theory in the Cavendish. Now in Oxford, John had been working on magnetism, a specialty there. But in Cambridge, he decided to turn towards the electron theory of solids. In order to learn the subject thoroughly, he started writing his monumental tome, Electrons and Phonons, finding there many research topics as he went along. I'm going to interrupt what he has written now, because to tell you something, I saw this morning as I entered the physics department, there was a blackboard in the foyer saying, it was for students, Friday, 20th of May, 9:30, examination module 304, electrons and phonons. It continues to be central. Research on electron transport in disordered media was very topical and led to John's calculation of the resistivity of molten metals, which was amazingly successful for reasons we understand better now than we did then. One other senior member of the group was Volker Heine, who's writing this, who had come in 1954 as a research student to work under Mott on electronic structure of solids. Mott himself was certainly present, but pursued his own interests and was not really part of the gang. Among the research students in the group, up to John going to Bristol, were Lou Shan from Hong Kong, Neil Ashcroft from New Zealand, Maurice Rice from the Irish Republic, and Leo Falikoff from Argentina, and Federico García Moliner from Spain, all now very well known. What is noticeable is that none of them came from Great Britain, as was true of almost all the group at that time, including John and Volker, both from New Zealand. The young Cambridge theorists wanted to do field theory, green functions, nuclear physics, etc. John was active on a broader front. He introduced the first systematic graduate lectures in the Cavendish, which later became Principles of the Theory of Solids, that's John's textbook, and he organised a colloquium series across the whole of the solid-state effort. Graduate students at that time were a rather neglected group, and and John at King's College became the first ever tutor in Cambridge with administrative responsibility in college, specifically for graduate students. The late 1950s and early 1960s were a time of considerable change in Cambridge and the whole of the university sector in Britain, of course, with many adjustments needed to the new era after World War II. Indeed, there were threats of another Royal Commission to clean up the mess in Oxbridge. John and his friend Jasper Rose edited the Cambridge Review, turning it from a largely literary journal into a mouthpiece for their policies of reform. Every issue, another sacred cow slaughtered, seemed to be their motto. And it was great fun. Of course, the university and colleges did gradually embrace change, for example in admissions policy, the founding of graduate colleges and much else, and there was no Royal Commission. I believe we owe John and Jasper a great debt for helping to focus the need for change when issues did not always seem very clear at the time. Of course, John's time in Cambridge ended with his move to Bristol in 1964. That was from Fokker. Now I want to make some remarks. I'm afraid I have to be a little personal. It's necessary in order to illuminate some aspects of John Ziman's intellectual character and his years in Bristol. In early 1965, I was finishing my PhD in St Andrews and had just been awarded a fellowship for postdoctoral research. In fact, Bob Chambers from the committee that interviewed me is in the room today. But where to go for that research in a subject not seriously studied in any British university? My supervisor, Bob Dingle, told me, there's a bright young scientist who's just taken the chair of theoretical physics at Bristol. His name is John Ziman. You might enjoy a book he's just written with his friend Jasper Rose about Oxford and Cambridge universities. I wasn't particularly interested in the old English universities, but Camford Observed, which is the book he wrote, captivated me. What the authors described about Oxbridge was exactly the superiority, conservatism and complacency that had disappointed me about St Andrews, and I loved the elegant and witty style in which they wrote. I responded to John Ziman as a kindred spirit, so I wrote to him, raising the possibility that I might hold my fellowship in Bristol, and at once John invited me to meet him. It was a memorable meeting. He took me to lunch where I met two of his friends he'd made in Bristol where he'd just arrived himself. The late Stefan Koerner, the distinguished philosopher. The late Howard Hinton, the distinguished entomologist. In the conversation that day, ranging over science, the philosophy of science, politics, literature, I enjoyed an intellectuality I'd dreamed of for years, but been starved of in the universities I had attended previously. Bristol seemed the very model of what a university should be. It was clearly the place for me, so I was delighted when John welcomed me in the department. So I arrived there, 40 years and 5 days ago today, actually, and joined the embryonic theoretical physics group. I was somewhat intimidated by my two colleagues. Derek Greenwood, who'd been appointed before John arrived, impressed me by having a formula, or half of a formula, named after him. Peter Lloyd was an inspired catch, an autodidact John had brought back from his sabbatical in Australia, and utterly brilliant. If he hadn't diminished his career by going back to Australia for family reasons, it could well have been him standing here today instead of me. Over the following months and years, I saw John's style of day-to-day intellectual leadership. It was highly interactive, not with me directly, because my research was on different topics, but he began each academic year with a meeting where he outlined the contribution of each member of the group, who became a node in a complicated diagram with many cross-links that John emphasised, that took place on the blackboard, took shape on the blackboard as he spoke. In those days, many scientists, myself included, were algebraic types. Theoretical physics was a collection of formulas, spare, pregnant encodings of reality. John gained his understandings and insights in a different way, by drawing pictures, simple diagrams that grew before our eyes each morning over coffee and each afternoon over tea. Several other senior scientists in Bristol also had this geometric imagination. It wasn't so prevalent in other places. It greatly influenced me, and I know other people in Bristol. One little vignette will give the flavour of John's intellectual style. We often discuss books we've been reading. I describe with enthusiasm Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, with so much enthusiasm indeed that John bought it and read it himself. Several weeks later he told me, "You were right, it is a wonderful novel, but you're too young to have understood it." Perhaps he was right. I ought to read it again and see. Another vignette will give the flavour of the free and easy academic career progression in the 1960s. About 18 months after I arrived, John reminded me that my fellowship would soon expire. Something that, in spite of having a young family and a vast mortgage, £3,000, I had not been fully aware of. He said, "You seem to be able to do research on your own." Self-winding was one of his favourite metaphors. "And you seem to be able to teach." I'd given one lecture course. "So would you like a permanent job? Would you like a lectureship?" "Oh, I hadn't thought about it." "Oh, okay, I suppose. Thank you very much." "Wait a minute," John said. "You know you have to have a formal interview." It was as easy as that in those days. Well, over the next decade, John continued to build up the theory group and lead the condensed matter part of it. But his interests were shifting. Following Camford Observed, which was about university and college life, he became fascinated by the wider international social culture of science. His first book, devoted to this subject, Public Knowledge, was written soon after he arrived in Bristol, and more followed. The intellectual break came in 1979 with his book Models of Disorder, summarising the many years he'd spent distilling, deconstructing, we'd say nowadays, the essence of a very mathematical subject, how to describe irregularities and waves scattered by them. That's actually a very important subject. In its quantum incarnation, it describes the physics of the electronic properties of matter, electrical resistance, magnetism, etc. I quote the last sentence of that book, referring to his life as a physicist. "I may perhaps be forgiven if I do not pursue the matter further, and take the opportunity of a natural break to announce that this is, as far as I'm concerned, the end." So that was his official break with physics. Now that period, I'm referring to the late 1970s and the early 1980s, was a time of considerable personal upheaval in the physics department. I'm not sure how to put this delicately. In a way, we were the scandal centre of Bristol University. 4 professors in the department, including John and 2 others here today, were, for different reasons, in what we used to call irregular situations, having separated from our wives and embarked on new private lives. John was the head of department then, and when that came to an end in 1982, he decided that as he was no longer a practicing physicist, it was wrong to remain in Bristol as a professor of that subject. So he left to be with Joan and to concentrate on his interest in science and society. We'll hear more about that science and society phase of John's life later today. Speaking personally, not just personally actually, because the view was widely shared in the department, I was disappointed when John abandoned theoretical physics. There was a poignant moment when he decided to sell his collection of physics books. I thought he had a lot more physics in him, and although I read and enjoyed, and largely agreed with, all that he wrote subsequently about the structure of science as a social phenomenon, as a profession, I thought his contributions to physics were more valuable, and he could have carried on making them. But John was a very wise man. He knew his own mind, he knew his own heart. So who am I to think he went in the wrong direction? So, continuing with physics, which Joan asked me to put together this section of today, Bob Evans, came to Bristol soon after I did, and he's going to say something about day-to-day working with John. Where are you,
Bob? As Michael said, I arrived shortly after him in Bristol, 2 years later, in fact. My undergraduate tutor in Birmingham was David Fowlers, who recommended I talk to John Ziman about possible PhD projects in solid-state theory. John was very charming and somewhat avuncular, He was only 42 at the time. I was most impressed, if not a little awestruck, by John's erudition and his great enthusiasm for the subject. He signed me up as a graduate student. When I arrived, there were 4 or 5 graduate students with John, and I'm delighted to see Graham, who was one of them here today. Derek Greenwood, Peter Lloyd, and Michael Burry were youthful, stimulating lecturers. John Alcott, Brian Pollard, and Noel Cottingham were soon to form a subgroup of particle theory. After a few weeks in Bristol, John thought it time that I had a PhD problem. He summoned me to his office along with Peter Lloyd. The conversation went along the following lines. Mott has some weird ideas about the electrical properties of liquid mercury. He thinks the anomalous behavior is due to some sort of pseudogap. I apologize to the non-physicists. He went on to say, I don't think this can be correct. You know, Mott has good intuition, but he's not a real theoretician. You should see if there are some special features in the electronic structure. Peter Lloyd will supervise you. Off I went. It took me quite a while to learn what pseudopotentials were, and a shorter time to ascertain who Sir Neville Mott was. Peter Lloyd was most helpful, but as Michael said, he returned to Australia during my 3rd year. I don't think I was instrumental for his departure. Anyway, I wrote a paper on liquid mercury in 1969, Evans, Greenwood, Lloyd, and Ziman. I'm pretty sure John never read it, but he was convinced that this work had straightened out Neville Mott. I think on the strength of that, he told me to write my thesis, and then he offered me a research assistantship funded by SRC. I was very grateful. He allowed me to work on anything I wished, literally. Well, almost literally. In those days, SRC were not as prescriptive as today. It would not be appropriate here to describe John's final reports on his research grants. Bristol Theory was a very cosmopolitan group in the early 70s. John was heavily involved with the Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, and he would encourage persons to visit Bristol. 2 particular characters come to my mind. There was one Theodor Spiridonov, a Bulgarian, who turned out to be a nuclear physicist. He was a perfectly charming fellow, but he knew absolutely no solid-state physics. And he was also convinced that he was being followed by government spies. Now, if you remember, there were terrible stories of poisoned umbrella tips and the like concerning Bulgarians at the time. It was an interesting period. There was another equally charming fellow from Mexico called Jaime Keller. He was a soulmate of John. They shared many interests. I helped Jaime write his 2nd PhD thesis. As a young person, I had a strong sense of belonging to the intellectual enterprise. The Ziman's gracious hospitality helped foster this feeling. I can recall John and Rosemary arranging wonderful summer and winter parties for the theory group. Lillian Murphy, the secretary who's here today, took great care of us, especially of John. Let me turn to John's science. As Volker Heine mentioned, John's best-known papers are those on the electrical properties of liquid metals. I looked up Science Citation Index just a couple of days ago to see just how well they are known. And it's quite remarkable. This first paper from 1961 has about 1,000 citations. One could say it was not a major advance in theoretical physics, but what it did was allow researchers to comprehend a huge amount of existing experimental data, and it set the scene for lots of future work on the topic. John's books have also been mentioned. I can remember John sitting in his office writing the last 2, Elements of Advanced Quantum Theory, Models of Disorder. He was incredibly focused. It was not wise to disturb him while he was writing. Occasionally he would give a few postgraduate lectures telling us what he'd written. Principles of the Theory of Solids is the best known. It's been translated into very many languages. Generations of students were exposed to the beauties of solid-state theory through reading this book. One of my colleagues tells me it remains the most used textbook in Bangladesh, and yesterday I went to the library and I ascertained that 3 out of our 5 library copies are on loan. As graduate students, we called the book the Purple Pearl because of the color of the cover. Every physicist recalls the quotations which stand as chapter headings. Naturally, they reflect John's wide range of reading. He put much effort into finding these. Allow me to mention a couple of examples. Chapter 9, The Fermi Surface. Thou comest in such a questionable shape, Hamlet. Chapter 5, Electron-electron interaction. The whole thing is a low put-up job on our noble credulity, said Sam. Norman Lindsay, The Magic Pudding. My German colleagues tell me that unfortunately these quotations do not translate smoothly into their language. John's writing style was unique. His books and papers bristled with clarity and erudition. Overseas colleagues would always ask, "Is John Ziman still in Bristol?" and follow quickly with a comment, "What marvelous books he wrote." His treatment of the physics did not suit everyone. One eminent reviewer of elements of advanced quantum theory wrote, "This is a book for those who take their Ziman neat." John's interaction with experimentalists was interesting. His background was rooted in mathematics, and I'm not sure he ever fathomed what this breed actually did. However, he had more tolerance for experimentalists than for computer modelers. It is better not to mention the latter. Let me tell you a short personal story about John and experimentalists. In the early 70s, Bush and his colleagues in ETH Zurich were making pioneering measurements of the electrical and thermal properties of liquid transition metals. They developed very special containment facilities, and of course they worked at very high temperatures. Bush invited the famous John Ziman to visit and help with the interpretation of the results. John was not prepared to do this. He had visions of gnomes working in a dungeon of the laboratory, using large furnaces and pouring hot molten metal. He sent me to educate the poor Swiss. I'd just completed my PhD and was totally naive, and I arrived in Zurich to learn that Professor Dr. Bush was a very important man indeed. Fortunately, his colleagues were most receptive and friendly, and we established a productive, long-standing collaboration. After returning to Bristol, John asked, "Bob, how did you get on in Zurich?" I said, "Fine." John said, "Good. I thought you would straighten them out." End of conversation. John did have a warm personality. Sometimes it did not show. He could be rather critical in seminars. Some speakers swore never to return to Bristol or would inquire meekly, "But will Simon be at the seminar?" There were similar reactions to Charles Frank, another Bristol theorist. Coffee time was always lively when John was around. Somehow we all had more time, and we seemed to be less pressurized in those days. My colleague George Nielsen recalls that one morning John came in clutching one of my large papers on thermodynamic properties of liquid metals. I was quite proud of the paper, and I asked John for his comments, although I knew he never read the details. John said, "Bob, I glanced at this. It's okay, but surely I was writing about this topic years ago." Well, I was somewhat taken aback, but said very quickly, "But John, I'm getting it right." John was totally unperturbed. He sipped his coffee, said, "Ah, good," and turned the conversation to other matters. The last conversation I had with John was some 7 or 8 years ago. I was bemoaning the state of universities, the perceived need for more management, the requirement to take on more students, in other words, the usual complaints. John, in his forthright way, proceeded to explain that I was probably part of the last generation to experience the old-style university science department, where heads of department were not merely middle managers. He was fond of that term. He was convinced that this had already become the case in his days. He did not like it. I wonder what he would make of Bristol's current university hierarchy today.
In the final part of this little physics section, we have Sir Sam Edwards, who knew John for a very long time in different stages of his career, and who will say a few words. Sam.
Well, I'm introduced to talk about science, and so that's what I do. But faced with the vast amount of science that John produced, books and papers, I need a simplifying way, and so what I would simplify is his effect on me personally. Now, the first thing I'll talk about is where he taught me a lesson. And it's one I've always tried to keep up to, but I'm not sure that I have. It reflects on this period, which we've already heard about, where John studied liquid metals. Now, a metal can have a very complicated form when it's in a crystal. And its electronic properties depend on that complexity. But if you melt it, then it just becomes a liquid. It's just a chaotic collection of atoms. So you get quite spectacular changes in the electrical properties, like the electrical conductivity of a metal and other properties, when you change from the solid metal to the liquid metal. Well, in far away from Cambridge, studied this and wrote some papers. And John, with the aid of the late Tom Faber and Bradley, wrote the famous papers which we'd heard about, and we've just heard about their citations. And there was something, not exactly a competition, but papers were emerging out of Manchester and out of Cambridge, and it was quite clear that the Cambridge papers won. And the lesson was this, that if you start looking at a complicated phenomenon, you really must understand the experimental situation. And John had at his disposal top-rate experimentalists, and he used them. And he got all the data right. He got the theory to predict everything. And I realized then, if you want to do that kind of physics, you've got to be absolutely on top of the experimental situation. So he's got 1,000 citations for that paper. I don't know how many citations I've got, but I'm not going to look. Now, the other thing I'll tell you about is to do with one of his papers. Now, I don't know how many people here are aficionados of Sherlock Holmes, but at some point, Sherlock tells Dr. Watson about some tremendous adventure. He didn't tell him. He told him that he had had a tremendous adventure in Sumatra. And Dr. Watson said, well, tell me, what was it? And Sherlock looked down on him and said, the world is not ready for this story. Right. Well, one of the fashions in the far-off days that we've been talking about was to understand liquid helium. And there were important advances and adventures. There were utterly obscure papers written by Russians. But there didn't seem to be a systematic approach to this subject. And then I found a paper by John, which I thought was quite wonderful. I'm going now to quote some scientific terms. I hope you'll forgive me. But there's a standard format for understanding theoretical physics, particularly when there is no friction present, and it's the Hamiltonian formalism. But the equations of liquids are very complicated and nonlinear, and they're not obviously related to the Hamiltonian formalism. But there was a German hydrodynamicist called Klepsch, who about 100 years before the Ziman paper had found a way of writing hydrodynamics in the Hamiltonian form. That is, in a form where you knew exactly how to get the right equations by differentiation. And the Klepsch variables were still awfully awkward. And John discovered that if you use the formalism that Dirac had for the electron, you introduced a complex quantity of psi, and then there was an psi star, and you would write a Hamiltonian, which was a quadratic plus a quartic, in this variable, and it described a liquid. So the standard liquid, Bernoulli and Stokes and all these other people would write it in Hamiltonian form. And at that point, you could apply quantum mechanics, and you got out of it the photons and photons and so on that were in the fashion. Now, this paper, to the best of my knowledge, has never really been appreciated. I think it's an absolutely wonderful paper, and it comes back to my mind now, having recently gone to a lecture where someone was looking at the turbulence, that is the shaking of liquid helium. And it was quite clear they were trying to think that liquid helium was just any old liquid, and it isn't. And the Ziman formalism will tackle that. And I thought that would be a wonderful problem, God help me now, 40 years ago, and I think I'm just too old to do it now. But there are quite decent theories of turbulence now, and if any of you feel that you'd like to read a really good theory of liquid helium turbulence, I can give you the reference in Proceedings of the Royal Society of this wonderful paper by John.
Moving away from physics now, James asked me to introduce the next speaker, the last speaker in this first half of today, Professor Peter Lipton. I don't know you. Hello. I do know you, yes.
John was a fellow of King's College, Cambridge from 1957 to 1964, and so it was entirely appropriate that Joan wrote to the college to ask if they would like to send a representative to this event. The college values John's fellowship very much for the contribution he made, for example, to the special care he took of graduate students, which set a precedent that now all the colleges are trying to follow. And when I heard that the college had been asked to send a representative, I was very eager to be that person. And that's not because I was in a position to tell wonderful stories about my time with John on the Fellowship of Kings, that we did not overlap. But the reason I was so keen to come along is because for my day job, I'm the head of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge. And I very much value the enormous contribution that John has made to science studies, or to what he called metascience. And I'm delighted to say a little bit about that now. I mean, John was obviously enormously productive in everything he did, in the physics, but certainly also in the metascience. He produced a great stream of important books. I'll just mention Public Knowledge, which we've already heard of, in 1968, Reliable Knowledge in 1978, Prometheus Bound in 1994, and Real Science in 2000. Now, what is metascience, and what was John doing? Well, think about it this way. Physicists study liquid metals. Metascientists
study physicists. Meta-science is an interdisciplinary pursuit. It involves history of science, philosophy of science, sociology of science, various branches of cognitive psychology. Now, the point of the exercise is not to uncover the scientific method that all, or anyway, successful or good scientists follow. One of the points that John emphasized is that is not the way science works. You don't learn to do science by learning scientific method. The main way you learn to do science is by imitation, and that's something that John emphasized. But we, as meta-scientists, can try to describe how that process of learning works and how the process of research works once the imitation has done its work. We can do that for a variety of reasons. We might hope that a better description of how science works will lead to some marginal improvement in scientific practice, but I don't think you have to take that view. Astronomers could take a great interest in describing galactic behavior without seeking to improve it. Similarly, meta-scientists can take a great interest in trying to make some kind of partial description of what is an enormously complicated social phenomenon, science, without hoping to improve it. We just want to understand it better. Science is one of the most significant things we have gotten up to as a species. So it seems well worth trying to understand it a bit better. And that's what John tried to do. And I think if you look at his work, there are at least 5 themes that emerge very clearly, and they're all, I think, important. The first is his naturalism. That is, his view, at least his official view, was that if you want to study the nature of science, the way to do it is scientifically. That is, science should be studied empirically. One should look and see how science actually works. So in that basket of disciplines that I put under the rubric of meta-science, officially, John had a preference for sociology, because that is an empirical inquiry into social groups. But I have to say, in reading his work, and I'm speaking here as a philosopher of science, I couldn't help but feel the more or less continuous undertow of philosophy that John felt. Officially, he wanted to be a sociologist, but the problems that the philosophers asked, he could not throw away. They kept interesting him, and he kept coming back to him. The second theme I would emphasize in John's approach to meta-science is his, there's not a good word for this, his socialism. That is, he thought that people who try to understand science very often make a mistake by modeling scientific activity on the activity of a single scientist. And to do that is pretty much to miss the phenomenon, because science is essentially a social activity. And you're not going to understand how science works or what it achieves unless you understand the dynamics of that very complex system. And I think that's a theme that runs through all of John's meta-scientific writing, certainly from his first book. We have to understand epistemology of science as social epistemology. We have to understand, in particular, how social groups manage to distribute trust among themselves, how they manage to criticize themselves. Because the warrant for scientific theories does not lie in a fictitious special method that scientists might be supposed to follow. But according to John, and I agree with him, the warrant for the results of science, depend essentially on that group dynamic. It depends on a process of trust and testing and interaction that can ultimately yield reliable knowledge. Theme number 3 is a kind of evolutionary picture of how science acquires knowledge. And here's, I think, one area where John's influence, the influence of philosophy on John's thinking comes across very clearly. Because John realized that you cannot hope to understand science on the model, say, of pure mathematics. You cannot hope to understand science as a matter of proof from first principles or axioms. Scientific theories always go way beyond the data that support them. They wouldn't be of interest otherwise. But that means you have to understand scientific knowledge differently. You have to take on board the skeptical arguments, especially from the great 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, about the risks of going beyond the data. You have to take on board the skepticism that is built into the norms of the scientific community. You have to take on board what John referred to as the path dependence of scientific development. How where you are at a particular stage is not simply mandated by the data you have at that stage, but also by the hypotheses and theories that came before. And you also have to take into account the revolutionary changes in science, that science is not simply an accumulation of facts. Things get removed from the class of scientific beliefs as well as added to them. And the best model, he felt, for accounting for all these features is an evolutionary model. You have to understand scientific models as being generated in a kind of conjectural way and then being subjected to a great deal of criticism. There is a kind of survival of the fittest, and that process of generation and testing and survival yields the reliable knowledge that science can, in the end, give us. No certainty, no proof, but the best route we have to trying to figure out how the world works. Fourth factor was now a kind of revolution, not in scientific theories about the natural world, but what John perceived as a kind of revolution within science. John felt very strongly, I think, that science was going itself through a fundamental change in its mode of organization. That whereas in the earlier period, say, of the 20th century, you had on the one hand more or less pure academic science, and on the other hand industrial-fueled science and engineering. They had different norms, they operated in different ways. But John felt that that division no longer really applies. But instead what you have is a kind of amalgam of those two approaches, which he referred to as post-academic science. It was science often done by academics, but working under many of the same constraints of industry and of engineering. A science that emphasizes utility, application, value for money. It's often large scale, it's often transdisciplinary. It's more like engineering than traditional academic science. The fifth and final theme I wanted to flag is John's commitment here not just to describing, but also to prescribing. In this case, not prescribing what you need to do if you want to be a better scientist, but what you need to do as a scientist if you want to be a better person, what your ethical and political obligations are as a scientist. And we can see that as flowing in part from the fourth point, this idea of a new post-academic science. Because what John argued is that before that merger, you had a kind of excuse anyway for ignoring the ethics in science if you were a scientist. If you were a pure academic scientist, you could take your sole norm to be the norm of truth, to trying to figure out how things work, leaving the issues of application to others and the ethical issues to others. If you were an engineer or an industrial scientist, of course there were ethical issues, but you could leave those to your bosses. You were a kind of hired gun, and they could take the moral responsibility. But once you get to that merger, to that post-academic science, then there's no way to avoid it. The scientists themselves have to take moral responsibility for what they're doing. And because of the tighter connections now in post-academic science between science and the state and politics, those ethical obligations become greater and greater. So at the end of the day, John, I think, became a kind of conscience for the scientific community, or at least he was urging the scientific community to find a conscience. Thank you.
Well, that was an extraordinarily interesting talk, as indeed they all were. I had heard all those terms from John, and I never knew how they arrived. We're going to have tea or coffee in a minute or two, perhaps you would allow me to tell you a story coming from a completely different constituency, and that of school, because I don't know if you know, but at that sort of time when he was reaching these conclusions, there were in the schools at sixth form level two courses that appeared almost from nowhere. One of them was called Science and Society. It was taken up by the public schools, and I suppose as reaction I produced one which was called Sister on Science in a Social Context. And I wrote to my famous cousin in Bristol and asked him if he would come and help us, which he did. And a lot of other stories follow on from that, as you can imagine. But however, what I remembered when I was listening to you was sitting in a really dreadfully grim teacher's centre in Haringey, which was where I taught. And we had just had a rather bad lunch, which he objected to quite a lot. But nevertheless, managed, as John always did, to go to sleep after lunch. And, but then he was rudely awakened by somebody at the back saying, I would like to tell you that I found out from the teacher next to me that she teaches in a public school. And John woke up and he said, it doesn't really matter what school she teaches in, we will have any school from Eton upwards.